Hey Ashlyn, you hear me?
I've got the app working. As long as we're not told that we have to put it on we have to build a backend that's working.
I don't know.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Alright, we're all here.
Alright, one sec. Trying to get Tony in.
Okay. I don't know what's going on.
There we are. Do you want us all to get into the call, Sam?
No, if Ashlyn can just cast to a TV.
Yeah.
We're doing that.
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
You can do it for the Slack app.
Alright. So Tony's in here now. So we today are going to talk through this CRUD REST utility that we've created in TypeScript that's going to do our API requests to our Rails project, so from our client to the Rails project. And so hopefully we're going to connect those two pieces back together again. We've talked about this before. I think Daniel had a question about like how do I write code that's outside of the component that I'm trying to create, and we talked about this idea of having services for business logic, and we do that. We actually frequently in the code that we write at Full Measure, we'll create another folder called HTTP services, which is just where we're going to put the code around making HTTP requests. So I'm just going to, yeah.
Sorry. Are we supposed to be looking at Ashlyn's screen, or are you showing us yours?
I've shared my screen with Ashlyn. Can you not?
How do I see it?
It's probably just behind some of your other windows. If you click back on Slack.
Oh, here, yeah.
Oh, yeah, now we see it.
Okay, all right. Yeah, sorry.
Good hire.
Yeah, at this point, we've been using Slack. Yeah, there you go. We've been using Slack for so long, I just take it as a given that everybody knows what's going on there. But yeah, so everybody can see me though. We're good.
Yep. Yeah, we're good.
All right. So I haven't done much. I created a new folder in our source folder called HTTP services, and what I'm going to do now is create a new file called crud.http service.ts. There is something interesting that you should probably be paying attention to. You see how here I've named this a TS file, but our components are generally named as TSX files. The difference is simply that TSX files expect that there's going to be HTML in them. So this is taken from a concept that was created by React. So they have what are called JSX files, and those JSX files are files where you write the HTML for your components. So it's technically just a convention, but that's what the difference between TS and TSX are. Both stand for TypeScript, which is the language that we're technically writing in. TypeScript, again, compiles down to JavaScript. So in the end, all of this is just the basic JavaScript that we started with at the beginning of the summer. I'm going to copy and paste something, and you guys can just use this. I'll push it at the end of the lesson here. But we're going to walk through what it does. So this is sort of the equivalent of the active record gem that you use on the Rails side to get up and running. This is the equivalent of that on the JavaScript side. There's a couple things you're not going to need simply because you don't have to worry about environments yet. You just have one environment. You also don't need to worry about so let's see. You also don't need to worry about sessions because you just have one person generally using this, or you don't care who the person is using it. You don't have, basically nobody's logging into your app as of yet, so you don't have to worry about that. And we're just going to start with very basic setup of this. All right. Not going to need headers. You won't need these new or special actions. And we'll throw some errors, but you guys don't have fancy error pages, which is all this is. So you don't have any headers that you have to pass. That's easy to drop out. And same thing here. And all right. Now the one thing we do have that you may want eventually, you might not use immediately, is the ability to cache your responses. So after you make the request the first time, you may not want to go make the request over and over again. It's just a performance thing. The way that you cache the responses, you store the result set in a database, and then we're going to look in the database and see if we already have something there. If we do, we're going to keep it. Otherwise, we're going to go make the request back to the server, to our Rails app again. For right now, we're just not going to worry about caching. We'll just make the request every time, because again, the projects you guys are working on at the moment are pretty simple, and you're not going to be making that many requests. We're just going to remove these extra pieces. And I promise we're getting there. We almost have this simple enough that we can walk through it one step at a time and actually see it all happen. Gosh. Okay. Even in our app, we rarely use caching. It's only for instances where we're doing some pretty substantial requests once. We don't reset it. All right, there you go. So that's pretty simple. The other thing I'm going to do is grab one example for us, just to start with. So we can take like user. So in the end, after we go through the explanation of what's actually going on behind the CRUD service here, all you're going to do is for each of your endpoints, you're going to, which is associated to a model, you're going to create a new class with the model name and then HTTP services after it, and it's going to extend from our CRUD HTTP services. So one of the nice things about going through this exercise is that we're going to learn a little bit about inheritance, which in object-oriented frameworks, we've seen this already happen in Rails. Our models, remember, they inherit from another class called ActiveRecord, which you went over a lot of what ActiveRecord gives you with Nathaniel, I believe, yesterday. We, in the same way, are creating our own class that we're going to extend from in our subclasses. So we're going to, each of our subclasses gets all of the functionality of our parent class. We can, though, extend it and make some modifications. In our case, pretty much always, all we're going to need to do is change what the subroute is. So in our case, we might be going to item, I think is one of our options. Items. Okay. All right. So, and then this would be our item HTTP service. And then we could, inside of our component, in some function wherever we feel like it's appropriate, we could say something like new item HTTP service dot query, and then we could say, I don't know, priority which is just going to do a GET request to our index action for any items that have a priority of 1000. So this should return an array of items, and we should be able to do whatever we need to do with our items. Okay. So what we're trying to get to in the end is very much where we were when we did the JavaScript fetch functions on our own last week. But what we're going to do now is use this utility, this library, to do it in a way that makes it a little bit simpler for us to make requests to multiple endpoints at once. We're going to walk through how that's all set up. Do you have any questions about, do we see where we're going with this? Right, so where we're trying to get to is a very easy to implement and re-implement HTTP RESTful. Yeah. Can you hear me?
That's good. We've got a question on our end.
Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
Can you go back to where you put that line where constant equal item? Constant item equal whatever.
This guy?
Yeah. Is line 17, does line 18 wait for 17 to finish, or is there a promise returned?
There's a promise returned. Yeah, so we'll see what we're going to have to do is an await here.
Okay.
I just haven't gotten to that piece yet. Yeah, so right now we're very high level, right? I just want us to understand that where we're trying to get to is an easy to implement way of doing RESTful requests to our Rails server. And we're going to talk about what the methods are and how they were built, but in the end you should just have to interact with a few functions on these children services that we're creating.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So let's start by just actually walking through the code for this CRUD HTTP service, what it is, what's going on, how it's working, all that kind of thing. All right. So we have our CRUD HTTP service. Classes, components are classes too. They just happen to have some special things that go along with them, like the ability to write HTML directly in it. But our CRUD HTTP service here, we're declaring a public variable called URL. So this is an instance variable. So you see here, we actually set it. We use this here, and then we can reference that instance variable throughout the rest of our model. Okay, so you'll see this URL all over the place. So this is very consistent with what you've seen already with the components that you've been building. We then have a constructor. So constructors are what happens whenever the model is initialized, and models are initialized when you call new. So if we go back to where I'm calling this class, you see it says await new item HTTP service. So right here, we are initializing the item HTTP service, and then we're going to call functions on that instance. So not that dissimilar from Rails, except that in Rails, the syntax would be something like item.new, right? So it's sort of flipped and where you put the new call, but very similar, and then in both cases, you're instantiating the class with a call to new. Now what actually gets called immediately when you call that new item HTTP service, or we could call new CRUD HTTP service, is the constructor. So that gets called immediately before any other functions that we call off of that instance. Okay, so the constructor is called as soon as we do new CRUD HTTP service. All right, so if we did something like that, response. Okay, it's going to call our class's constructor function. And in fact, you can see here, it's telling us, hey, actually, I need an argument called API URL. And that's because right here we have API URL. So this is a little different than the types of functions that we've worked with in the past, only in that like the function name doesn't match. Right? So what we seem to be calling as a function is the class name. What's actually being called is this function called constructor. And this is just a special relationship that exists when you are instantiating a class. So in JavaScript and TypeScript, when you instantiate a class by calling it with new, you're actually calling the constructor function of that class. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you say yes? I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So, yeah, I mean, this is something that takes a little while to wrap your head around. For now, just understand that when you do new and then the class name, what you're actually calling is the constructor function inside of that class. Okay. All right, and that's going to be important later when we go to extend this. All right, so if we're looking at the CRUD HTTP service, if we called new CRUD HTTP service with an API URL of items, we would be setting a variable this.url to http://localhost 3000/items. Right? It'll do something like that, right? So that just means we're going to hit that endpoint. That's our URL. That's what we're going to use later on to actually do our querying, our posting, our putting, all the things that we want to be able to do. So if we start looking through this, a lot of these things are going to be very similar to what you've already done when we were using the fetch URL in pure plain JavaScript. We created a query function, for example, that took parameters, and then this line of code just converts those parameters from an object into a string, right? So it converts things from something that looks like to something that looks more like or rather okay. So you don't necessarily need to understand how that's working, just know that that's what this is doing. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to say, okay, we're going to create a full URL. A full URL is going to be the URL, and then a question mark, and then the query string. So in the end, what we might end up with is something that looks like okay. In other words, if you were to anywhere in your TypeScript code, so from your component or anywhere else, if you were to call new CRUD HTTP service, and then we passed in items, we said .query priority 1000. At this point, so if we called this somewhere else, so like let's just actually put that in one of our components. Let's say we put it here. Okay. Then when we get to this line of code, when we get to line 18, it's actually going to come in here. We're going to change our API URL to be http localhost 3000/items because we pass into our construction function the word items. And then we're querying, our parameters are priority 100. So our parameters are priority 100. That's going to get turned into something that looks like priority equals 100. And so at this point, our full URL is going to be priority equals 100. You guys see that?
Yeah.
All right. And then what we're going to do is pass the full URL into our GET request. It's a cool little thing if you haven't figured this out yet. In RubyMine, if you hold down the command key and you click on a method, well, even just scrolling over it does some cool things in that it shows you where the method is coming from and what it's going to return. But you can also click on it and it'll jump you directly to it. So all it did was jump us down the page, but it's just a faster way to get there. It'll also jump you into other files if it's actually defined in another file. So if we go back to red.tsx here and I command click on this query, it jumps me to here. and do the same thing here. So it's just a useful little shortcut if you're trying to figure out where things are coming from. All right, so we get down here to get full request, and remember that we're calling that with our full URL, which looks something like http://localhost 3000 /items $priority equals 100. Okay. All right. So then we're going to do the normal things that we did before in JavaScript, which is we're going to do a fetch request. We say constant response equals await because fetch returns us a promise. We're going to fetch our full URL, so we're going to put this whole thing in. That's the endpoint that we're going to end up hitting. We pass in a couple of options, so we're saying our method is get, saying our mode is cores. You probably actually don't need that in the way that your projects are set up. And then we're going to get our response back. So it's going to give us back, ideally, all of the items, an array of the items that have a priority of 100 from our Rails app. We're then going to check, in addition to getting the response of the array, it gives us a status back. This is because the Rails app just gives us back a status with every request that we make. And we're going to check to see, well, if we got a 204, that means that we deleted something. It wasn't found. It was successfully not found because we deleted it. So we're just going to return an empty array. If we get back a 403 or a 401, those statuses mean that that you're not authorized. So we're going to throw an error that says, sorry, but you're not authorized. And all this is going to do is put in a console log that says, hey, you're not allowed to do this, and it'll stop the execution of the rest of your JavaScript script. Otherwise, if you get a 500 is an internal server error. That means that most likely it means something is broken on your app side, like maybe the parameters you sent up weren't handled correctly or something, but you got some bad error, and so we're going to say this is it, you're in a bad state. Or if you get a 503 generally means that there is no API app endpoint. It means, in our case, usually that a build is in progress. They were swapping out old code for new code, and so we put build in progress for 503. Otherwise, we're going to set data. So this is most cases. This is what we're looking for. We're going to set data equal to the JSON of the response, which in our case, ideally, is going to look something like right, and then maybe some other one. Okay. All right, so we expect to get back an array of items that have a priority of 100, so hopefully we're going to get something like this back, and then we're going to return our data that then we can use to do whatever we want. Okay. You guys follow that generally?
Yeah.
Hopefully this part in particular is a lot of review. Nice. All right, so that's our query. So that's how we hit our index action. We have a find by, which is very similar to query. The difference is simply that we can actually it looks like in this case the way it's going to work is it's just going to give us back the exact same thing. Is that right? Yeah. I think the intention here was to do something like this, where we get the first one back. But honestly, we're probably not going to need that for the moment. Where's our get? Did I lose it? Oh no, there's our find. Okay. This is what I actually wanted next. Alright, so this is our find function. Find just works just like the Rails project. In fact, if we want to, if it's easier for you guys, we can use the same syntax that we do in Rails. So where, right? If you use this function, it's going to do an API request. It's going to call our index method on our controller, which is actually going to do a model.where. So in our case, it would do an item.where with those parameters. The find is going to hit our show action in the controller. So we're going to pass an ID So the URL looks a little different. We do /ID instead of passing all the parameters up. So that's going to hit our show function, and that's going to do an item.find, and it's going to pass in the ID we send, and it's going to give us back exactly one instance of that object. We won't get back an array. Put is the rest command, but what we're really doing here is an update. And you see there are a few changes that happen when we do the put, so we're no longer doing a GET request. In this case, we are doing a put, so what we do is we pull the ID out of the payload that we're sending, because it should have an ID, because what we're trying to do is update something that already exists on the server. We add that ID into our URL, and then we change our method for our fetch function to be a put. And we also have this redirect follow. You guys actually don't need that. That shouldn't matter. But we do send a body up now. So now we're going to send up the stringified version of the JSONized version of our payload to Rails. And then Rails is going to send us back the updated version as a result. And then delete. Delete, we actually let you put in the entire payload, and we pull the ID off of it. So this is like your entire item object. We pull the ID off of it, and then we're going to send it up, and we're going to do a delete on that. To simplify this, we can just change it to be an ID, which in your case is going to be a number. Oops. Alright, so you just send up the ID of the item that you want to delete, and it should give you back a response that has that item before it was deleted, but it's gone now. And then finally, our post, it's really a create, and that's just going to call this post request, which is really for you guys, we can just do it in the simple way that we did the put. Which is just going to be so we're just going to change the method to be post, and we don't need an ID because it hasn't been created yet, so it doesn't have an ID. And this is going to hit our create method on the Rails controller, which is going to call our item.create with whatever payload we end up sending up. Okay. So it's a relatively simple utility, but it's pretty powerful in that anytime you have a new model, a new endpoint, a new set of endpoints really that you want to hit, you can come and you can just inherit from this CRUD HTTP service, and all you have to do is override this constructor function, which remember just looks like this. It says constructor API URL string with the API URL that you care about for this new model. Okay, so in our case, our item HTTP service, the subroute that we need to replace API URL with is items, and so all you do is call super items. What super does, it's a special term. This is a common term used in a lot of programming languages. It just says, I want you to call my parent class, so in our case that's CRUD HTTP service, I want you to call that parent class's constructor function with these parameters. So in our case, what super is really doing is it's calling CRUD HTTP service with an API URL of items. And then the rest of the functions, so we don't have to write any of the other functions, the rest of the functions work correctly as we inherit them from our CRUD HTTP service. So now if we come back here, we don't need to call CRUD HTTP service items, we can just call item HTTP service like that, query. And that should be it. Does that make sense? Or, yeah, were there questions? I'm sure there are questions, but Where are there questions? How can I help?
I think we're good.
Okay.
So
Who's lying?
this is the managing all the requests to connect it to the Rails backend, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
So
in our, we would set up the models and controllers and all that stuff,
correct.
and
So
then do our
yeah. So you have to have your models and controllers set up already on the Rails side, and once you do that, you can access them using these tools on the JavaScript side.
cool.
All right, so let's try this out a little bit. I think I still have my Rails app in a condition where I can get it started. So let's go. All right, so if we go back just to refamiliarize ourselves with Rails controllers. So in the Rails app, we have our controllers. We have items and boards controllers is what we created in our previous class. I'm just going to go look at items. So the items controller is just inheriting from our active record rest controller, which again I can command click and go look and see what that looks like. So we have our index action, which is just going to return our model. So this is going to return a list of all of the items in our case that match the parameters that we send up. Oh, hold on one second because I'm going to run out of power. All right. On the JavaScript side, let's see, we have our component. I'm going to get rid of these bits for a moment just to go back and make sure we're in a good state. We will start up our client project, our stencil project. So we go. All right, so here's our little app. We're just on the to-do list component, which we did some weird renaming to prove some things last time. But really, we're here, right? We're on our app to-do list component. We're in here. There are some hooks, which I don't know if you've familiarized yourself with on the stencil projects, but you can, before the component loads, and this is often where you want to make your initial request to get your list down, there's a function that's available to you that's called component will load, and this function will get called before the render function is called the first time, and only the first time. But in here, we can say constant items equals new item HTTP service dot query priority 100, 1000, whatever we want, and then we should be able to log out our items. There's something weird that seems to be happening.
I think you changed query to where.
Ah, that's right. Thank you. So we can do where. All right. And then if we open up just to see what data we actually have available to us. I'm going to go into the console. Say item.all. Look, say collect priority. Oh, that's cool. Alright, so now all of our items are set to a priority of 100 just so we get back a reasonable list. But if I go and reload the project here, look at our network request, we should have made, you see here, we make a fetch to HTTP localhost 3000 items, priority equals 1000, should have been 100, so we probably won't get anything back. But here it shows you the query string that happened, and then we get a preview of the result set, which is nothing at the moment. But if I switch it 1000 to 100, and remember, part of the issue with us getting back nothing is why are we all the way at debugger even though we haven't gotten a response back yet from the server? You guys?
You need to wait.
Yeah, we needed to wait. So we didn't wait for the promise to resolve, and we talked about this a little bit, but it's a good example of JavaScript just continuing. Right, so it hit 16, it says make the request, but nothing's telling me to wait for the request to resolve, so I'm just going to move on. I'm going to do line 17, so I'm going to log out items, which is a promise, and then I'm going to hit the debugger. So we can actually see right now, if we look at items, it's a promise that's pending. Okay, so it hasn't been resolved yet. But if we want to wait for that response before we do any other code, which we probably do, we can use await. And if we use await, it tells us we have to use async for our function. But if we try that again, now items is the full list of all of our items that have a priority of 100. If we look at our network request, we see we got back a status of 200. We see our preview has all of them in it. We see we did a GET request. We got back a status code of 200. We hit this URL, and we got back this response. The response actually looks like this, but we've converted it in our little CRUD utility into objects that look like this. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And now the neat thing is, right, and you probably have started doing this already in your own projects, so you have that back. So let's go ahead and create a new, we already have a state variable called items, which is just set to hello and goodbye. So, let's just set it as, it's going to be an array of objects. We're just going to say it's an array of any. And we're actually going to wait to set items. We're going to dereference the response that we get. So we're going to say constant items, item data. And then we're going to say this dot items equals item data. Okay, that way if items was already set to something, now it's going to be dereferenced. It's going to be reset to something completely different. Okay, so this items is going to be set to item data. So now when items is anything, we want to actually make that our list, which will happen here because we're doing render items, we're returning this dot items, etc. We probably want to say wait until items is something before you try to render.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Why are you forcing the render when it's about to happen in?
Say that one more time.
In line 14, you're forcing the render by changing the state variable, right? But the render is about to happen anyway, right?
Yeah, so it won't happen until after the component will load function finishes. The bigger, what can happen is that if I set items to something else, like this, I now, after I get back the response, need to set items to be the new data so that I can loop over it. Loop over the new set, not the array. right? So if I just did this at this point in time here when render items, when I say return this.items at this point is a blank array. So I need to wait until I get back a response before I try and do this.
I see.
That makes sense? Now, we're going to leave it as undefined, and the reason why we do that is if we get back either a good or a bad response, we probably want to render our HTML, but we either way also want to wait for the response to come back before we render this HTML. One of the things that you could put here instead of just returning nothing is a loading screen or something, so that you're waiting until you actually get a response from the server before you show the rest of the screen. But for right now, we're just going to leave it blank until we get back a response. So if I refresh, there we go. There's all our items. Oh, man. So this is happening because we have this JSON stringify items, and the other one is happening because we are doing our render items, which is passing in an item and an index and a blue. Okay, so if I get rid of the JSON stringified version, we get something that's a little nicer. There we go. So there's all our items happening, and we can swap them. No, we did it twice because we have this weird, instructive stuff. Yep. Okay. Now part of what's happening here too is we're showing blue and yellow because that's our, if we go back and look at our app list example, we have this .blue that we were showing. It's just for instruction about properties and events and weird things that happen there. But if we go move those, we should see that there's just a bunch of blank items. And the reason, if we look at what we get back in our list, we have task name, we have priority, we have the created at, we have whether it's archived or not, we have its board ID, right? But when we're actually listing it out, we're just listing this dot item, which we're passing in here as just item. Really what we should probably be doing is calling this dot item dot task name, which is not a string. There we go. And now we get a bunch of tests, and a couple of them are blank. Okay. So that's great from getting stuff down. Now we want to be able to actually create things or update things, and we can do that just as easily. So we can even immediately, let's say, create a new item. Maybe even before we do the initial request. We could do that by let's create a new one. We're going to give it a board ID 1. Actually, let's get things down by, let's just get the task for a particular board. Priority 1000, task name, go to store, archived false, right? And every time I refresh the page, we do another create. So it creates a new one every time. If we wanted to help see that they're actually different, we could do something like right? So now we're just creating a bunch of items that have a random number at the end. Okay. Now you should start to see how you can use this, right? So you now have your buttons that you're clicking on to do a create that are calling a create function. So really you'd probably end up with something like yeah, probably create. Maybe you're sending the task name or something. And then you need to push that onto the end of items. So you're going to say dot items equals okay. So essentially what you're going to get back in your response is the newly created item. And you want to be able to add it on to your array of items that already exists. So we can do something like this. So down here we might, underneath of our items, just do an ion item, ion label, new item, ion input, type is text, on click, really probably, yeah. So we can do something like that, and then maybe when we click on this button that says save, we're going to save it. Alright. So now when we click on the save button, what's going to happen? If I refresh this, I have our save button. If I click this save button, what's going to happen?
It's gonna create a new one.
It's going to create a new one. What's the task name of the new one going to be?
Anyone know?
What'd you say, Evan?
I was polling the group. I don't think we know.
Oh, okay. All right. So let's follow this, right? So when I click on button, we're going to call the function create with a parameter of what? Something. So if we come up here, line 33, and we go to the create function, task name is what at this point? Something. And so then we're going to do an await new item HTTP service create. And here's our payload. So this is the same payload like if you were in Rails, you were doing item.create, and then we passed in this object. Right? So in this case, what is task name going to be? Something. And so when we get our response back, we're going to get back an item that has a task name of what? Something. And then we're going to put it onto the end. You guys see that?
Yeah.
Alright, so if I refresh it and click save, there we just did we got it back at status 200. If we look, we got back now an item that has an ID of 25, which is the next ID in our stream. It gets the correct created at and updated at setup. It's got a board ID of 1 and a priority of 100 like we told it to. If we look at the headers, you can actually see that we had a request payload. This is what we're putting in that body method in our request in the JavaScript and the CRUD HTTP service. And so here we can see what we're sending up is archived false, board ID 1, priority 100, task name something. And what that's returning is the same plus created at ID and updated at. You see all that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's how you do the create, and then your updates are going to be very similar. You're going to want to pass in one of your items for the update, and then you can just call update. Right. So you can just as easily just actually do it on your own. So we can do an update of, like, let's say, here, we're going to load all the items. Then we'll take the last item and update it. So if we did that, we would say this dot update. Well, let's just take the first item. So let's make a copy of it. Okay, so after we do the fetch, we're going to get a copy of all the items. We're going to take the first one of those. That's going to be our copy. Actually, let's just copy the whole items array, so we have something completely different. All right, so now we have our copy. We're going to update the copy. And say the response from that. Okay. And then we're going to update our items. Let's update copy first. So we'll update the 0 copy of items. All right, so this is just our first item. We're going to update it to be whatever the response is, and then we'll set items to the copy so that we get a dereference version, and now it's going to update so that it moves from what it was previously to the new thing. We probably want to do something to change it so we can actually see it though. So constant, we'll just name it first item equals copy 0. Change it to let, and then we'll just say first item dot task name equals first item, and we'll update first item, get back the copy, and see it happen. So we'll put a debugger in and we'll walk through this whole thing from the point of getting the response from our initial request through changing it to be the new thing.
Wait, can you go to the update function? Why are you adding the response?
We don't want to do that. It's just because I copied it from create. So actually, so we're not here for now. For right now, we're just going to do this so that we can follow it all the way through. And then we'll move some of this down in that lower function. So let's just take the return. Yeah, so that should do it. All right. So items right now, our first item. Huh. Did it? Yeah, it reloaded on its own. Hold on. The auto reload happened while we were on the screen. So let's see. Let's just change it to be so at this point. Yeah, so at this point, items, our first item already has a name of first item. We're hopefully going to change that in a moment. So we're going to start by getting a copy of all the items, which is the same as what we were just looking at. We're going to change the first item's task name to be first ASD. We're then going to pass this first item into our update function. So it has task name first ASD. So now we haven't made the network request yet to do the update, but we should as soon as we go to the next line. So you can see that happened here. So now we've done the network request. What we did is we went to HTTP localhost 3000 item/2. Our payload has a task name of first ASD. The response that we received back has a task name with first ASD, so it actually did the update. We should also see that the updated at has updated to a more recent time. So it was created at 1516, so updated at 1541. And then as we move forward, we're going to set this.items equal to the copy, which has now replaced its first item with the new first item. And then we should see the list reflect the changes that we made. So that's it. So we're doing an update. The way that you would really do this, we probably just want to move most of this down into the update function. And we don't need that, we don't need that, we don't need that. So whatever the new item is, we're going to update it. And then we're going to set so you do probably want an index to come in to help you, but otherwise you could figure out where the item lives by using some underscore functions to find. So here we can actually do that. So we're doing an update so the item has an ID, right, because it already exists on the server. Otherwise we'd be doing a create. So actually finding that item in our array is pretty simple. So we could just get the index of where it exists in the array so that later we can swap it out, and that's a pretty easy thing to do. So let's make sure that we have a copy of our items. So that's our copy of our items. And then we need to know what index we need to replace. You guys see why we need the index? We need to know where the response, where this particular item exists in our array.
Yeah.
Right? Because we need to replace just that item, right? We need to replace position 0 or 1 or wherever it is. So to find that, you can do index of start items, comma, and I'll walk through what's happening here. Okay. Then we need to import. All right, so we can simplify this a little bit. Constant found item. So underscore gives us this nice functionality that's very similar to the find by syntax that exists in Rails. So we can search through our array of items for that particular item that has an ID of this item's ID. And so that'll give us back a reference to that actual item. And then you can do an index of that item by passing in the item that you found into this index of function, which gives you back the index of where it exists. So then when we get back our response, we can say copy response index equals whatever the response is. And then we can set items equal to the copy, which is going to reset all of our items, all of them. And so what's going to happen is we're going to now have our items set to the items that were previous there, and the updated item is going to be swapped out. You guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, all right, we'll walk through it. I'll put a debugger in here. We'll call update on the first item. And so we're not, well, I'll just put a debugger at the top of the function so we can see. All right, so let's just go here. So the item that we're passing in has been updated so that the task name is going to be Vanilla Sky. Just to make sure this dot item's currently, it already got reset. Stupid auto reload. Oh, okay. It's because it's a reference to the item, so it's still changing it. All right, but we have our item that's coming in as Vanilla Sky 2, so we're going to go look for that item in our array. That should have found the item by the ID, so it gives us back just that item. Then we're going to go find the index by passing in that particular item. Oh, what just happened? Because of weed. And then once we get the index, here we've got the index, which is 0, which is our first one, which is right. Then we need to wait for our response. So now we have to put our debugger one line down so we can actually wait for the update function to complete. Oh, we put all this stuff. We don't want that. We want. We created a recursive infinite loop. Did you guys see that? Right, so we were saying, and it's just because I copied stuff from higher up, but it did say, okay, this function is the function that it's inside of, so it's just going to keep calling itself over and over and over again. You guys see that?
Yeah.
So we don't want to do that. So would literally break our computers. But now we've got a response back, so we get Vanilla Sky 2 back. We're going to get a copy of all of our items. We're going to replace the position that we found earlier. And then we're going to reset items to be what we get back. So now it's Vanilla Sky 2. Okay. And that's actually happened too. We made the network request. So we did an update. Got back Vanilla Sky 2. We sent up in our payload that we wanted the task name to be Vanilla Sky 2. We can change it to be 3 or 4 or whatever. We can also do, like we could do items 2. We'll do that and change it to Vanilla Sky. So here we've just gotten the response back. It's for the first one. There we go. Okay. So that's, I mean, that's the basic functionality of what you need for your to-do list, right? You should be able to look at that and sort of figure out how you can use this code to do it on your own. There's plenty of improvements that can be made against this code as well, but this is a pretty simple way for us to be able to do GET requests, creates, updates, and then a delete would be pretty similar as well. Let's just do. The delete function is just going to be delete. It's going to take in an ID. Do delete. And then I want to do, something similar to this. Where you again find the item by the ID, you get the index of that item, and then you're gonna swap it out. Well, in our case, we're actually gonna delete it. So we want to do so after you get the response back, you're going to want to delete it. And then you're going to set items equal its copy, and that's going to be it. Okay? Does that at least get you guys started down a path where you see how you can use these tools to be able to do your requests, etc.?
Yeah.
Starting to see the pattern.
Yeah. And I'll push this up so you can actually like play with what I have there. And you can see, I hope at least, where if you create a trash can for each one of your items that calls that delete function, it's going to delete it and it'll actually remove it from the array of items, and so you should be able to actually see it disappear from your page, and it'll actually be deleted from the database. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right, so the video is up on YouTube, or at least it should be. I'm going to push this code to another branch on the stencil project. So you can go copy and paste whatever you want, or pull it down and play with it. You guys should have something to be able to work towards for Monday. So yeah, we'll evaluate on Monday. Monday, I do want to do a review of where your projects are. If they're not quite ready to show the rest of the company, that's fine too. We got to things a little bit slower than I wanted to this week, but we'll show them the next week if we need to. But hopefully you guys have enough to be able to get a working leaderboard for the bingo night stuff. Hopefully you have enough information to be able to at least go Google and take code from here, etc., to be able to figure that out. If not, it's okay. We'll reevaluate on Monday. But on Monday we will look at everybody's project to see how we're doing. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Any questions?
Are we all showing individual projects on Tuesday, or are we supposed to try to make one project together?
Yeah, so on Tuesday we will, so on Monday we'll look at each person's project individually, and then on Tuesday we will, well, hopefully the rest of Monday, like Monday afternoon, we'll be able to combine things into the best project, and then we'll show the company one project as a group. Other questions?
Any big plans for the weekend?
Oh yeah, huge plans. I'm getting engaged tomorrow, which is why I'm not in the office right now. I'm taking care of some logistics. Yeah. So.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. I just realized this is on YouTube. She'll never see it. It's fine. Yeah, it's a surprise, unless she goes to my YouTube channel. But,
Oh, wow. Okay.
yeah.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else?
Where should we meet you for the surprise?
Oh yeah. We're gonna be down on the wharf Saturday night. If you're interested in watching two people get engaged, and some really awkward stuff, I'm sure.
I'm just kidding.
Well, yeah, no, I know. What's that?
Go get him.
Yeah. Thanks, buddy. All right. Anything else?
No.
No.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. All right. And then yeah, next week we're just gonna keep We'll reevaluate on Monday. Monday's class will probably be just looking at your projects and trying to clean things up because I want to try and get them into the best state possible for showing the company if we can do that on Tuesday. And then once we get to that point, we'll be able to start actually assigning out the real product project that we have that you'll be working on for the rest of the summer, which is around creating this thing called syllabi. It was a project that we we did a couple years ago. That was a lot of fun. So we have a lot of screens for it. It's really pretty. I'll talk a little bit more about exactly what it does. There is an app now that exists that's very similar to what we're going to be building. If you want to go check it out, it's called Scholar. It's Tony's channel. Get out of here, Siri. So there's an app called Scholar, which does some very similar things to what we're going to try to do. It's essentially crowdsourcing tasks that need to be completed for a course in a university. So it turns out that do you guys have Blackboard? Have you used Blackboard or some similar LMS at your school before?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it turns out that something like 30% of people who have access to Blackboard actually use it. The other 70% of professors just don't. It's clunky, it's annoying, it's another thing that they have to do that's not their workflow, etc. And so the thought was, and this Scholar's thought too, is why don't we take that out of the hands of the people who it feels like a pain and a burden to have to build these things and put it into the hands of people who care about it, the students. And so, like, can we easily do something like have them upload a syllabus from their phone or their computer, and then send that syllabus off to like MTurk and have a group of people put in the information, and then make it so that if that syllabus is validated by somebody on our side, anyone else who says that they're in that class, they just get all of the tasks from that syllabus, and then we can start doing things like sending out push notifications and text messages to help them be successful, reminding them about upcoming project assignments, upcoming quizzes, upcoming exams, etc. And so that's sort of what we're going to be building, is this tool for crowdsourcing course information and task completion. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it should be a fun project, and you'll be able to have input on where the product actually goes and how we build it. But it's a nice one because we did build a version of this several years ago, so we have the screenshots and all of that. And so we'll assign out pieces. Some of them will be assigned out as individual projects, and some of them will be assigned out as group projects. In the end, they're all going to end up in one repo, and hopefully at the end of the summer we have like a real thing that we might even be able to put into the App Store, and you guys can have a cool app that you built.
Cool.
All right.
Yeah.
Sweet. All right, guys. I'll see you on Monday.
All right. See you tomorrow.
Yeah. All right. Bye.
Bye.